Right, we've now got recording started. Let me just turn off the transcript though, because that just becomes very annoying. Right, so I've stopped the transcript, so we're now just recording. So, okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to hand over to Andrew. So bear with me one moment.
Thanks very much, Karen, and thank you for the invitation to come, as it were, and thank you to everyone for being there. Yes, please do chip in with any comments or questions as we go on. I mean, obviously unmute yourselves. I think let's keep it informal. But there we go. That's my topic for tonight. I'm going to be talking about what was happening in terms of cooperative housing before the First World War, effectively. And as I think you'll find out, it was actually really quite a lot that was going on in different ways. We have in this country a relatively small cooperative housing sector compared with other countries in Europe and North America, for example. But it wasn't always the case. There was already an active movement in the immediate years before the First World War. So let's move on. Karen, next slide. Just to run through what I'm intending to say tonight, I'm going to start by showing you some pictures of some of the pre-1919 cooperative housing societies which are still functioning today. Say a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about the mainstream cooperative movement, i.e. effectively the distributive societies, the grocery shops, and what they were doing or perhaps not doing in terms of housing in this period. I'm going to be talking about a society called Tenant Co-operators Limited, who introduced the idea of a divvy for tenants based on the amount of rent they paid. I'll go on to talk about the co-partnership housing societies and explain what was meant by that. I want to say a wee bit about the link between cooperative housing and the Garden City movement, and in particular, actually, the Garden Village and Garden Suburb movement, which two movements at the same time, which work very, very closely together. Then I want to touch on a suggestion which was made at the time that perhaps cooperative housing provided an alternative to local authority provided housing, and there could be some pros as well as cons in doing that. And that leads us into the 1919 Housing Act, a really significant piece of housing legislation. And at that point, I will come up with a final slide which tries to summarise some of the things I've said. So I hope that's okay with everyone. Should we start? Let's start with a quick run through of some of those societies that are still there today, more than a century on from when they were first founded. And here's a photo I took last year. Last spring, I spent quite a lot of time on the train from where I live in the Calder Valley, from Manchester and Leeds, going around to look at some of these societies. This wasn't so far from home. This is Manchester. This is actually the east of Manchester, the community of Fairfield Tenants. As you can see, really quite an attractive society, quite an attractive little street in a rundown area of East Manchester. And then I went to Bourneville, south of Birmingham. Bourneville, of course, is known as the place where George Cadbury from Cadbury's The Confectioners established a model village. But Bourneville Tenants was actually a separate initiative. It was tenant run, and there you can see the current chair of the society and the person who at the time was the vice chair of the society in their part of Bourneville. And then I went to Nebworth in Hertfordshire. Took a wee bit of detective work really to find the societies which are still going today. It involves pouring through the mutuals register as well as doing other bits of detective work. This is Nebworth. These societies don't tend to be in touch with each other. They don't tend to be members of CCH, the Confederation of Cooperative Housing. One or two are members of Co-ops UK, but most aren't. So they are tending to operate very much in a vacuum, and really were quite surprised when I told them that they weren't the only society of their kind. So that's Nebworth. And then I went, well, again, not so far from home. This is Manchester Tenants, this time in the south of Manchester, a very attractive community based around a central square. And in the central square is the meeting hall. You can see it in front of you. It has a bowling green, crown bowling green in front of the meeting hall. And over to the left of the photo, you can see one of the two tennis courts which were built in the early days of the society. There's still one tennis court there, and then the other's been turned into a multi-user sports area. And then I went to Keswick. This is Derwentwater Tenants, very close to the centre of Keswick, but tucked away. If you were a tourist going to the Lake District and you know, visiting Keswick, you probably, or in fact almost certainly wouldn't discover it. And Keswick was built 1909, 1910, 25 houses. Those 25 houses are still there today and still run very much as a cooperative society. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see the 10 societies which to a greater or lesser extent are still operating as cooperatives. One or two I haven't mentioned. Hereford's interesting. There's two very small societies in Hadley and Suffolk and St Mawes. Anchor Tenants to the east of Leicester, and I think I've mentioned them all now, haven't I? Yeah, but there are two question marks at the end of my slide because I am not entirely convinced that I found all the pre-First World War cooperative societies still functioning, and there may be others out there. So, you know, there's a challenge to people to see if you can find the ones I've missed. Okay, let's move on. This slide shows just some of the cooperative housing societies which were functioning immediately before the First World War. I mean, I could actually have made this list about 3 times as long, but if you just cast your eye down the list of places, you'll see it was a broad movement geographically. Scotland and Wales represented there, and also the regions of England as well as London. And although these are no longer functioning as cooperative societies.
Andrew, I think part of the issue is as to what you define as a cooperative organisation, because certainly there was a number of societies which were started up really in cooperation with the mining companies in South Wales, and I don't think there was very much cooperative. They used a cooperative model as a funding model to get the money out of the Treasury through the Public Works Loans Board, but it seemed to be more of a funding vehicle for the benefit of the mine owners rather than for the tenants.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's not true of all the societies by any means. Some were bottom up, as we might say. The Leicester Anchor Society, which is still there today, was an initiative of the workers who are working in one of the productive co-ops, Anchor, which was one of the shoe producing co-ops. But you are right, and actually that was true increasingly as the years went on. So I think that's less true of the first decade of the 20th century. It's more true as we get into the period immediately before the First World War, and certainly afterwards too. Maybe we can come back to that. Can we come back to that point later on, actually?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Fine, yeah.
But these were societies which certainly were incorporated under cooperative legislation, and I think, just looking at my own list there, most of them, not all of them, most of them would have identified as being part of a movement. So yeah, we need to bear in mind that some were set up as co-ops just to find the funding, but that wasn't entirely true. But let's go on and talk about what the mainstream distributive cooperative movement was doing at this time. I mean, the situation in 1900 was that the vast majority of people, certainly the vast majority of working class people, were renting their properties. building societies were going, we were seeing the movement from the terminating societies to the permanent societies. But nonetheless, it was still true that the vast majority of people were renting, and they were probably renting from small landlords, maybe the local solicitor, or maybe the builders themselves were the landlords. So there was discussion in the movement about whether the co-op world could be doing something to house its members. And there was something of a debate about whether the way forward was for people to be encouraged into owner occupation, or whether they should be tenants of their cooperative society, or whether there was some sort of intermediate, slightly more cooperative model, which brought together aspects of owner occupation with aspects of cooperation. There's a photo there of Hollyoake Street. I mean, I don't need to tell you, I'm sure, that obviously named after George Jacob Hollyoake, the great cooperative pioneer, and you will find Hollyoake streets around the country, plenty of them. The next slide shows, there you go, Cooperative Terrace. Again, there's a lot of street names which will remind you of the cooperative history of the streets. Industrial Street is usually a giveaway. Equity Street, Unity Street. These are all sort of clues that we may well be talking about a street which a cooperative society put up. But if we look at data from just at the beginning of the 20th century, this was collected for Cooperative Congress. Just under 600 societies said they were involved in some sense in housing, and they had invested in total just over 8 million. You know, not an insignificant amount of money, partly because they had more money sloshing around than they knew what to do with. Co-ops quickly took on the role of a sort of local savings bank, and quite often societies found they were sitting on cash they really couldn't use. So some of the interest in housing was because of that. But again, if you look at the lower part of the information on the slide, you'll see that the vast majority of cooperative housing activity was offering mortgages. So effectively acting as a kind of building society in almost exactly the same way as a building society would operate. As well as that, something over 5,500 houses had been built but then sold on. So the number of houses which were held by the cooperative society as landlord and let out to its members was relatively low, 8,000, just over 8,000 out of that total of 37,000. So for different reasons, I think the mainstream cooperative movement, the distributive movement, did not particularly do anything very innovative in the housing world. But there was one society created, and I'm going on to the next slide now, Karen. Thank you. There was one society which was established in London, very much under the auspices of Benjamin Jones, a figure that you may well know of. Ben Jones, originally from Salford, parents both worked in the textile trade. Ben worked for the fledgling, for the very young Cooperative Wholesale Society shortly after it was set up, and then was sent by the CWS to open the London office of the wholesale. And he was playing around in his mind with ways that the cooperative model could try and do something for housing, particularly given the desperate housing crisis in London at the time, the awful situation that faced many people who were trying to find housing. And he was a witness before the Royal Commission on the Housing of the Working Classes, which was meeting in the early years of the 1880s. He gave his evidence in 1884, and he was talking about a way that a society could be established, a cooperative society could be established, where the tenants didn't own their own properties, but they did have some element of ownership in it. And they would acquire ownership partly by getting a dividend on the basis of the rent they paid. And that dividend would be held in the society. It wouldn't be paid across them, it would be held in the society, so that they could have some of the security which owner-occupiers could enjoy, but without some of the disadvantages. And the disadvantages were that people at that stage frequently had to move for work. And if you had to move for work, you owned your own house, you had to sell your house, and you would then find yourself engaged in a slow and very expensive process of trying to realise your asset. Tenant Co-operators was launched in 1887, and gradually it developed properties around London in different parts of the city, in East London, in Penge, South London, Camberwell, and then finally in Epsom, just outside in Surrey. Ben Jones's original idea had been to have a sort of whole string of properties around the city, so that if you were living, I don't know, in say in Penge, but you found work in Chelsea, you would be able to move to a tenant co-operator's property in Chelsea, or if you found work in Harrow again, you could move around the city. That didn't really materialise. If we go to the next slide, you can see one of the developments. There we go. That's the Peckham development, Lucas Road, as it was when it was first built, left-hand side, and as you can see, still very recognisable today. And again, if we move on, the tenant co-operators have been slightly dismissed, slightly written out of the story as not really being particularly successful. I think that's slightly unfair. I mean, it's true that there was a problem with the model, and there was a problem in achieving tenant engagement in the society, given that the tenants were, miles apart from each other in different developments. There's a problem too that they had one particular development in East London which struggled to be tenanted, and the committee had to weaken the original really firm rule that all tenants had to also be members of the co-op. But I think nonetheless it was actually very well managed by its volunteer committee, and it did pay a dividend. Over the first 25 years of its life, it paid an average dividend of 6%. So not to be entirely dismissed from the story. And certainly Ben Jones is a very interesting figure. Again, a lot of you will know of Ben Jones and what he did. Very active, building the CWS in London and building actually the southern section of the Cooperative Union in an area which was something of something of a cooperative desert before then. So, okay, that's tenant co-operators. Now let's move on to talk about the so-called co-partnership housing societies. And the first of these was in Ealing. That's a photograph of Ealing a little bit later, just before the First World War. And the idea of Ealing originated with cooperative-minded people in the building trade, who were thinking of buying land together and then building their own houses as owner-occupiers. And they were persuaded to actually look for a cooperative model, so that rather than becoming owner-occupiers, they would actually have shares in their own collective society. And this was Ealing Tenants. Ealing Tenants took some of the ideas from tenant co-operators, so it took on the idea of the divvy. But it also introduced a new rule, which was tenants had to be fairly significant investors in their society. £50 was ultimately required of them. They could pay that in instalments. But that was quite a significant change, and it did mean that the people who were going to be able to become tenants of that society were going to be people who were, well, in fairly secure and fairly well-paid employment, working class or lower middle class, but not casual workers. The Ealing model was picked up by workers in two productive co-ops. I've mentioned already Leicester. There was a cooperative press established in Letchworth, and again the workers there picked up the idea and set up Garden City tenants, and also in Sevenoaks, and that Sevenoaks is an initiative primarily of the Distributive Society. But the co-partnership societies were very, very closely linked to an organisation called the Labour Association. That's a cue for the next slide, please. Okay. Labour Association set up at Congress in 1884, set up really as a propaganda organisation to campaign for one side of what I called here the cooperative argument. And you may well know that the latter years of the 19th century, there was really quite a big argument at Barney. I mean, a controversy. It became at times quite heated between two different wings of the co-op movement. Those who felt that workers for cooperatives should be treated differently from workers in conventional business, and in particular they should share in the profits of the business and probably be engaged in some sense in the management too. And those who didn't support the idea of sharing profit with workers, the CWS experimented for a short time, but then moved into this camp. And their argument was that the profits from cooperative business should be shared more widely, not just with those people who were fortunate enough to get their employment in co-ops. So there was a big argument within the movement. Went on for 30 years. Wasn't really ever resolved until early in the 20th century, when effectively the two parts of the movement moved away from each other. But the Labour Association was associated with the idea of sharing profits with workers, supporting worker-run productive co-ops, what we now call worker co-ops. And from early in the 20th century, increasingly the idea of co-partnership between labour and capital. As the socialist movement grew in Britain, so those associated with particularly the Liberal Party tried to put forward the idea that there was actually a shared interest between labour and capital. And the co-partnership housing societies extended this idea by saying that there was a shared interest between tenants and those who invested in housing. And the co-partnership societies were trying to demonstrate this was so. The key person in this story is Henry Vivian, Devon man, originally a joiner. He became secretary of the Labour Association really quite young, in his early 20s. He ultimately became a Liberal MP, 1906 to 1910. And it was Henry Vivian who, in some ways, drove the development of co-partnership societies. Let's move to the next slide. So quite quickly, from Ealing and Sevenoaks and Leicester, though Leicester was slightly more delayed, and Letchworth, a national movement developed. In 1907, Vivian and his allies launched something called Co-Partnership Tenants Limited, CTL, which tried to act as a sort of national facilitator for this growing development, this growing movement. It offered to help with acquiring land, it offered to help with acquiring building materials collectively, it offered to help ultimately with architectural design, and certainly it offered to help with finding the funding which individual local societies were trying to find to enable their developments to go ahead. And I think quite interestingly, given what's going on at the moment, co-partnership tenants made use of what we would now call community share capital. In other words, it made use of the provision in the Industrial and Provident Societies Act for people to be able to invest in cooperative societies, partly as share capital, partly as loan capital, because at that stage the maximum for shares was £200 per individual investor. So the illustration on the right is an advert from a magazine at the time. It shows pictures of some of the societies, and although you can't really read it, it talks about the amount of money they've managed to raise through what we would now call community shares. And Bernard Shaw was probably the highest profile investor, or at least the person who's best known today. He invested 5,400 in both in cooperative societies individually and in co-partnership tenants, and talked very openly about how he wanted his money to do something positive. He was saying most people just go to their stockbroker and invest in Shell or, you know, railways in Canada or somewhere. He wanted to feel his money was achieving something. Next slide. Okay, here's an architect's drawing of the the Liverpool tenants development. Because really quite quickly, as the first decade of the 20th century progressed, the number of societies joining co-partnership tenants grew. Hampstead societies in the Hampstead Garden suburb, Manchester tenants, you saw a photo of that at the beginning, Harborne, Birmingham, Stoke-on-Trent, Liverpool, Wolverhampton, and there were others too. And as I say, CTL raised loans both in community shares, but also from the government through, and it's been mentioned already, the Public Works Loan Board. These were loans. Grants weren't available from the government until the First World War, effectively until the 1919 Act. So these were secured loans, repayable loans, which were obtainable. Somewhat controversially, CTL required adherence to its own corporate governance model, and that wasn't one member, one vote. That was a vote for the amount of money you had invested. So much closer to a traditional company model than a cooperative model. And Vivian himself was chairman of CTL, and particularly after he stopped being a Liberal MP, ran the organisation very much, I think, as his own personal venture, and much more as a conventional property company and less as a cooperative society. But one of the reasons I think why these early cooperative and co-partnership societies developed as quickly as they did was the link which developed from, well, really from 1901 with the Garden City movement. Ebenezer Howard had produced his book on garden cities. I mean, this may be familiar history to you, it may not be, but Ebenezer Howard is the person who effectively came up with the idea of garden cities. And the first one of those was brought to fruition in Letchworth. Quite strong cooperative involvement in that, actually, or at least involvement by individual cooperators, not necessarily formally through the movement. But this person here is not, this photograph here is not of Ebenezer Howard, it's of Raymond Unwin. Raymond Unwin, an architect, interesting guy, involved in his youth with the Socialist League, the William Morris organisation, the secretary, I think, of the Socialist League in Manchester, knew Edward Carpenter. Edward Carpenter, of course, set up sort of back to the land community in Millthorpe, just outside Sheffield. Early pioneer of homosexual rights. He was gay. He lived openly with his lover, his male lover. So Unwin came from a radical background, and I think brought his radicalism into his work. And Unwin was responsible really for reinterpreting the garden city idea in terms of much smaller communities, such as the developments in Letchworth for the cooperative society, the development of Hampstead Garden suburb. And his idea was that people should be moving out of the city areas where you might get, say, 50 houses per acre to the suburbs where you could get 10 to 12 houses. He was advocating decent housing, decent working class housing, and he was advocating that through a move away from the dense, polluted, crowded city areas. And his influence, I think, and his legacy is really very significant, particularly in terms of what happened post-1919 in Britain, certainly in England, where we didn't see apartment living in the centre of the city, as we might have seen in continental Europe. We saw a spread into the suburbs. but a significant figure and somebody who worked very closely with the early cooperative societies. Now, I should say that although such work has been done on cooperative housing history, it has tended to focus, has not been very much, but it has tended to focus on CTL and Henry Vivian. But I think we need to remember that by no means all the societies chose to go the CTL route. And there were lots that didn't. Some of those that didn't were Bourneville, Hereford, those two are still going today, Warrington, Tennant Co-operated itself. And there were also separate developments in Wales and to a lesser extent in Scotland. And there was also a separate rural initiative through something called the Rural Co-Partnership Association. I've mentioned already that CTL from 1910, I would say, became much more hard-nosed, and Vivian and his overall legacy is a problematic one, despite his energy and despite the fact that he did do a lot in the first decade of the 20th century to create that that housing movement. Now, there was discussion in the years before 1914 about the role of municipal authorities, local authorities in housing. There were some really interesting council housing developments put up before 1914, particularly by the London County Council. Liverpool too had quite a lot of council housing at that stage. But there was discussion by this person. This is Sibylla Gurney, who was active, a young woman active in the movement at the time. By John Nettlefold, who was an influential Birmingham councillor, among others. And they were saying, well, is there some way that local authorities could assist in the development of decent housing by acquiring the land and perhaps funding the acquisition of the land, but then leaving it to cooperative societies to actually develop the land and run the societies as tenant-run organisations. So this was a relatively influential idea. It was mentioned by Nettlefold at there was a parliamentary select committee looking into the issue in the 1906, 1907. It was mentioned by him then. He spelled out how it might work. And he was saying, actually, you could give councils powers through compulsory purchase to acquire building land, but then make sure that they pass the land on to societies established under cooperative legislation. And Nettlefold's argument, and Sibylla Gurney's to an extent too, was that way council money could go further, that actually councils weren't necessarily best established to become landlords. And here's a good liberal principle, Nettlefold was a liberal, that actually self-help is better than top-down state help. And I think that is an interesting argument, given that we had council housing as a dominant housing model, social housing model in the 20th century, but thanks to Thatcher and thanks to other things, we have moved away from that now. So maybe there's some arguments there which we might want to revisit. I'm going to wrap up by taking you just immediately after the First World War. You remember Lloyd George talking about homes for heroes. Well, actually, he didn't say that. He said, that's the misquote. He came out with a phrase that he wanted habitations fit for the heroes who'd won the war. But I mean, in soundbite terms, obviously, homes for heroes is a much better soundbite. But there was a lot of discussion around what could be done at the end of the war to provide the housing which was felt to be needed. There's one estimate that 500,000 houses were going to be needed very quickly after the war. And I think a general acceptance that the private sector couldn't deliver those houses. Co-op societies were seen very much as potentially complementing local authorities, and both models, both the model I described a moment ago, the sort of the shared model, and council housing were supported by this act, by the 1919 Housing Act, the so-called Addison Act, named after Christopher Addison, who was the minister who shepherded it through. If we go to the next slide, please. Yeah. One of the things they acted was to introduce grant funding for social housing. I mean, if you're involved in the housing world, the social housing world today, if you're involved, for example, through the community land trust movement, as I've been recently, you'll know that grant funding through well, Homes England, in the case of England, is absolutely essential if we are going to get new social housing built. It came in 1919, it wasn't there before, and it was obviously a really useful change. But nevertheless, the Act offered more generous concessions to local authorities than it did to co-op societies. I think Addison felt blackmailed, actually, by a lot of local authorities who said, no, we're not going to get involved in housing at all. So he felt that he had to actually really give councils the very generous terms to persuade them that they would actually get involved in housing. Co-op societies were given measures to raise 75% of the capital they needed, but they really struggled to find that 25%, missing 25%. So despite perhaps the government's best intentions, Christopher Addison's best intentions, the 1919 Act, in the end, didn't do many favours for co-op societies. And although there was some interesting developments in the early 20s, some of the steam went out of the movement, some of the momentum went out. And ultimately, that strong movement, which had seen more than 100 societies, they disappeared in different ways. There were various triggers for demutualisation, including legislation in 1939, including obviously Thatcher and right to buy legislation, and also that time when usually after 50 years, when the capital which had been borrowed for the societies was finally repaid. And yet, and now we're going on to my last slide. And yet, some conclusions. Let's not think that this movement was not insignificant. It was widespread. It was bigger in my estimation than the current community land trust movement, which has also been growing really fast in recent years. And it could, had history been different, had played a much greater role later in the 20th century in terms of provision of social housing. There was a challenge in finding the capital. It's still there today. There was a problematic legacy in terms of Henry Vivian and particularly CTL's governance arrangements, which meant that investors could take control over tenants, and that did happen in some instances. There was an issue, there was a tension between bottom-up tenant control and top-down investor control. And as I say, the 1919 Act, in hindsight, did deal co-ops an unlucky hand. But I would argue that this history is actually still relevant for us today, particularly now, actually, as the community-led housing movement has started getting a good head of steam behind it. At that point, I'm going to stop. Oh no, there's one more slide, which is a plug. There we go. I have earlier this year, as you may well know, brought out a book on this history. If we were meeting face to face, which would have been nice, I would have had a little pile in the corner which you could have come and bought a copy for me if you'd felt so inclined. But instead, if you feel so inclined, if you go to the Gritstone Publishing Co-op website, it's published by Britain's only publishing co-op, which I'm a proud member. If you go to that website, and there is a discount there, you can buy it for £15. Normally it's £18.95. Although please don't disregard your local independent bookshop if you've got one close to where you are. You can get it through them too, of course. So let me stop there, Karen. Maybe lose the slides, yeah, so we can see each other. Should we lose the slideshow altogether? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, just doing it.
Okay. So.
Okay. So has anybody got any questions? Yes, Chaz.
Thanks. Yeah, I think George has also got a question as well, Karen. So I'm actually been very interested in reading the book. because one of the areas that I've been trying to do some research on the last few years is actually the development of council housing before the First World War, particularly in rural areas, because I think there's particularly with what was happening with legislation from the 1909 Act, there was a much greater emphasis on local authority being a provider. And you get interesting things like, for example, and I can't remember the guy in Sevenoaks, he worked through his local council as a councillor to try and get the council to build council housing in Sevenoaks, and then seems to have gone off in working in the cooperative model because he wasn't able to achieve the council housing route. And you then end up with people like Alderman William Thompson, who is a really fascinating character, who is a major advocate for municipal council housing, but then goes off to be one of the key people for one of the, and I can't remember which of the cooperative ones in London it was, but and I think it's really fascinating when you read his funeral, who was actually sitting there around the table, as it were, and how influential he was.
It was Ruislip, actually, his the society he was engaged in, actually. I think you find Ruislip Manor.
That's it. Yes,
one of the ones
yeah.
still there today, actually. Yeah.
And then you have other oddities like what was happening with Birmingham, and clearly that was a very much an ideologically based battle, and not Cheltenham, the Hereford scheme is quite fascinating in the fact that that was actually compulsory purchased, slum cleared as a Part 2 scheme by the city council, and then transferred to the cooperative. So there's quite a lot of overlap between these different things which were going on. And I think the other one that is really fascinating is this agricultural mutual co-ops, which were actually really small scale, with 6 or 8 properties. I tripped across one in Evesham, which sadly only lasted for about 2 years before it went bust after the Second World War, because of after the First World War. But I think one of the issues seems to be this whole issue about the capitalisation that they needed to be able to get things going. And the thing that always strikes me, looking back at Culpin's 1930 state of the thing, the ambition that was there, that if the war hadn't come along, the likelihood is that there would have been, at Nebworth, it wouldn't have been 30 or 40 houses that are there. You would have been talking about 8,000 houses on a massive estate.
Yes.
And so there is that issue about what happened post the and I think you've answered it very much, about crowding out of the cooperative in that desperate rush to get councils to build at scale. Sorry, that's a bit rambling.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I mean, the work you're doing sounds really interesting. We ought to have a long chat, actually. The Hereford you mentioned, Hereford was very interesting because it was really the only example before the First World War of that model, the model which I mentioned, John Nettlefold, Sibella Gurney were advocating, where the local authority actually facilitated a cooperative society from getting established. And it's great that Hereford's still going there. I was amazed actually to discover, again, this came through looking at the mutuals register, that it was still there. And I went to meet their secretary, who was, I think, equally surprised to find that their society had attracted attention. But just
when I had a poke around, I think one of the Bulmer family is still on the board there.
I think yes, I think you might be right. Actually, it was obviously very much encouraged by Fred Bulmer of the cider company, who was very philanthropically minded in that sort of Edwardian way. But Yeah, no, I had a very interesting day in Hereford actually. It's an interesting one, and they chose very consciously not to follow the Henry Vivian route, and there's some extant correspondence between Bulmer and Nettlefold about why Bulmer didn't want to join CTL. So that's quite interesting too. The rural side, I mean, it's great if you could do some work around, particularly the rural co-partnership movement, which established the Hadley Society, which is still going. I went to visit them; they're interesting. It's established the St Maur's street of, well, I think there's about a dozen houses in St Maur's, at a time when they were getting concerned that tourists were driving local people out of the housing market. You know, that was 1910, 11, nothing really changes. So, I mean, I think, and I don't think anyone has done much work on that, so that would be fantastic. But you're right, I mean, council housing before the First World War, there was some, what's that one that's always mentioned, Chaz? It wasn't actually a cooperative, but it was a council engaged somewhere in the home counties. I don't know. I think it's in my book, but I can't bring it to mind. But yeah, so yes, some interesting stuff to be uncovered there, I think. And it followed the legislation the Liberal government had brought in on small holdings and allotments. I think it should be seen in as a sort of follow-on from that initiative. And again, that followed on from 30 years of campaigning for the 3 acres and a cow, for land for the workers in the countryside. Yeah.
And so, sorry, just to think on you know, there's a really fascinating example of Evesham, where you had actually a cooperative organisation was actually working with the smallholders, but they used then a council housing model to develop the housing, and in a matter of 2 years they built 200 housing units across 5 different sites, which is quite incredible. Anyway,
Chaz, let's you got my email address. Let's keep in touch on this one. Really good.
We'll do.
Yeah, really good to talk to you.
Right, so we'll go to George next, and then Richard afterwards, if that's okay, Richard.
I'd like to ask Andrew in relation to, you mentioned Letchworth and the growth of the societies around their home counties before it went into CRS. Was there any work done by those fledgling societies after the war in order to assist cooperative housing? And the other question, is in relation to CDS and David Rogers, because I had when I was a councillor in Milton Keynes, I had an interesting experience, shall I put it this way, where there were certain people who were who had taken over the democracy of CDS developments, and I just wondered how much or how big was that, i.e. the lack of democracy in these new societies, which allowed them to become very cliquey and very insular.
Okay, well, there's 2 or 3 things there. I mean, I deliberately didn't look at later generations of cooperative housing. I mean, Johnston Birchall, of course, was the great cooperative historian in terms of looking at this. His PhD was in cooperative housing, and his books on housing do include chapters on that period. We're talking about the 1970s, 1980s. So I'm probably not the best person to talk about that. I mean, I think there was, in the societies I've been looking at, there was an issue around participation and democracy, and some of it sprung from the top-down nature of some of the societies, being brought about by the great and the good, for the good of the workers, rather than by people for themselves. You mentioned the distributive society. Letchworth actually wasn't really linked to the distributive society. That was the top-down development by Earl. Can't remember the name of the landowner up there. Chaz, can you remember his name? Anyway.
Sorry, Nebworth? Or,
But if we are talking about distributed societies, let me just mention Woolwich RACS, because they did try in a very practical way to have that middle ground between owner occupation and co-op society as landlord, and their way was using leasehold legislation. So they built estates, and they sold the houses they built to their members, but they didn't sell it freehold. They sold it leasehold. 99, was it 99? Yeah, 99 years, as a way of trying to keep it within the cooperative fold. And ultimately, that really didn't achieve what they'd hoped for. I've recently discovered, actually, since writing the book, that other societies did this too. A friend up here has recently moved into a house in Todmorden, which was built by the Todmorden Industrial Society, and her house is on a 999-year lease. The Cooperative Society obviously decided it was going to have a 1,000-year millennial freehold of the property. So obviously it wasn't just Woolwich that was experimenting with ways that this there could be some sort of middle ground. But I have to say that by and large, co-ops did support owner occupation as a way of housing members.
Have you anything, as I say, I appreciate CDS's, in quotes, fairly modern relation to what you've written, but is there any lessons the movement can learn in terms of democracy within cooperative housing?
Well, I think it can. Yeah.
From today,
I would argue actually this is an issue for housing associations too. I mean, the regulator does have requirements on housing associations to engage in tenant participation. But when we lost council housing to housing associations, we lost the right to go and sit in on the meetings where decisions were taken. Obviously, local authorities, journalists and members of the public can show up. We don't have that same right with housing associations. And personally, if I was advising, if I was wanting to encourage a forthcoming Labour government to do good things, that would be one of the things I'd draw their attention to.
Okay, thank you.
Richard, you've heard me already. I was down in Birmingham recently. It was great. We had a really nice evening in Birmingham, actually, as a sort of West Midlands launch of the book. So thank you for coming around a second time. I appreciate that.
Thank you. I often learn different things hearing something a second time. Just on that point, that point you just raised about long leasehold arrangements, the Eccles Society, which again is up your way, I believe they owned most of the land in the town, and I assume that the housing was then leasehold. And in fact, most of the ground rents in Eccles were only sold off by United Norwest Society about 15 years ago, because I can remember thinking they didn't get much for them, frankly.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's the side.
Who was chief executive of United Norwest? No, let's not go there. All right. All I can say is that in terms of the discussion and the movement, it was very much Woolwich that was given as the example. So I'm sure there were other societies that were doing this leasehold model, but it was always Woolwich that was mentioned. It was always the Woolwich people who argued the case. So, and of course, they had a very big development down there. Yeah.
I mean, I've got a few observations, really. One is, at the very beginning, you said that when you went around meeting people, they were all amazed to discover they weren't the only one.
Mm.
And I just wonder, with a kind of burgeoning community housing movement again, in which there are debates between, more democratic models of community land trusts and more philanthropic models, whether there's any opportunity or mileage in kind of introducing different generations of cooperators to each other. That was one question. But then I had a couple of points, one of which I've put in the chat. When I was doing some work on the history of worker and housing co-ops much more recently in the West Midlands, this is going back about nearly 20 years, I came across the Dronfield Pioneer Health and Housing Society in Derbyshire. I can't remember why I came across them, but they appeared I've just looked at the mutuals register. They're still going. They were registered in 1946, and they appear to be, I suspect, a group of miners, partly inspired by the Peckham experiment in London in terms of the kind of health side of things. But when I had more of a look, as I say, about 20 years ago, at that time, they were still operating, but they seemed to be administered by the parish council, which was a site called town council, which is an interesting position. The other one is, and I guess Chaz probably knows about this, the South West Co-operative Housing Society, which again was set up just after the Second World War with support from Albert Mansbridge of WEA fame and the people at Dartington Hall and some of the Garden City pioneers. But it was actually a federal society of retail co-ops in the Southwest who wanted to work cooperatively together to provide good housing, particularly in rural areas. It never had any element of tenant democracy, as far as I know. In the 1980s, it was the victim of an early right to buy court case where a co-op milkman in Bridgewater, who was a tenant of the society, essentially took them to court to say that some of your properties enjoyed grant funding from government, therefore the Right to Buy Act applies to you where you've said it didn't before, and they lost some of their housing stock. They still exist in a different, again, their registration still exists, and I've put the link in the chat, in a different form now, but the co-op movement link was lost. I mean, it was as recently as 2004 or 5 when they dropped cooperative from the title, and Edgar Evans, who was a CRS co-op group activist in Bath, he had been the chair or the vice chair. He stepped down. They dropped the co-op movement link, and I can remember at the time David Rogers being very bitter about the fact that this was a society that had tens of millions of pounds worth of freehold assets, which could have been used to capitalise the development of new housing. And effectively it's become just another philanthropic housing association that, you know, doesn't really see itself having a wider remit. But that was pioneering work by retail societies in the Southwest after the Second World War, particularly the West Somerset Society, actually, who were very small but were quite pioneering in a number of ways. But it had huge ambitions and was stymied by the inability to find, I mean, basically being crowded out by local authority housing.
I happen to have had some involvement with South Western Co-op because of some of their supported housing schemes in South Gloucestershire, and they had quite a large development at one stage, which had been lost quite a lot by Right to Buy in Yates, I think. And I think part of their problem is that they'd lost an ambition of where they were going, and I think that's what ended up with them looking and think. And I think the regulator in some form, either the Housing Corporation, HCA, or someone had their teeth into them at one stage.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the things that ended up with making them look at other avenues to pursue.
I mean,
and I know there's other cooperatives that have been lost. There's a society in Bristol which is way away from the co-op model now because of the changes which have been pressurised a lot by the regulator on people. Solon, that's who I was trying to think of, which is Solon South West, which is again capitulated to the housing association model. Sorry about.
Let me just come back to Richard's first point about those 10. if it's 10, if it's not, it might be more than 10. We don't know. They have all been very used to ploughing their own furrow. As I say, they almost all of them had no idea that there was anyone else out there apart from themselves. One or two have joined Co-ops UK, which I think is good. Following my research, they now know of each other, and I have sort of encouraged them to talk to each other a bit. But obviously, you know, they are autonomous societies. They can decide. Some are quite consciously cooperatives, I would say, and some are more community benefit societies, if that distinction is one you understand. In other words, some are running their societies really just for the lucky tenants without any wider remit, and some of them are much more looking at the housing needs in their community and perhaps yeah, much more community benefit approach. I have some concerns about one or two of the societies who have very weak asset locks. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to mention that to them without having the unfortunate effect of drawing people's attention to the fact that they have weak asset locks, and there might be people there who want to take advantage of that to demutualise. We did have the example of Sevenoaks tenants demutualising just 10 years ago, which was an unfortunate example. Most of the societies, I think, have got quite good professional advisors who have been giving them good advice, and I think most of them have got quite tight asset locks now in their rules, although you can argue when it comes down to it just how rigorous you can write the legal wording to really protect societies if the membership is desperate to wind it up. So yeah, I'm hoping that partly as a result of talking to people, then they may feel more engaged with other aspects of the cooperative housing scene, but you know, we have to allow them to run their own affairs in their own way.
I mean, I just wondered if a little bit of buddying up with local, you know, and the new generation of community housing and CLTs and what have you, if people are up for it.
Yeah.
If they're not, that's fine. But
exactly, yeah.
You know, a little bit of mentoring, because sometimes if you flatter, a little bit of flattery can go a long way, can't it?
Sure, of course it can. Yeah. Do we have any more? Karen, you're muted actually.
Sorry about that. I muted that because I have a little coughing fit. Has anybody else got any more questions for Andrew? Yes, Sarah.
Am I muted?
No, we can hear you.
No. I hadn't written down properly the name of the proactive liberal, the woman, Sibella?
Sibella, yes, an unusual first name.
It's
SYBELLA, so it's a Y at the beginning, not an I. And Gurney without the E, G-U-R. I'm just looking at the chat now, G-U-R-N-E-Y. She's interesting. She is mentioned in the Oxford National Biography, Dictionary of National Biography, but would you believe it? She's mentioned as part of the entry for her husband. It's classic, absolutely classic, isn't it? I think she's a very interesting figure. She went to Royal Holloway, so she was you know, in the days when women struggled to have university education, she was at Royal Holloway. She was very involved in the cooperative movement, particularly in the Labour Association. In fact, she edited the Labour Association magazine newspaper for a time. She put her money where her mouth was because she was also a generous investor in housing societies. And maybe inevitably, given the period I've been researching, you know, it is very much one man after another who entered the picture. So it was great to be able to research Sibella a bit, somebody who we should remember, I think, and who, yeah, clearly had society been different, or had she been male at the time, would have probably been somebody we definitely did know about by now.
Thank you.
Sarah Richards said that she's also part of the Quaker banking family from Norwich as well. So
Oh,
there you
I
go.
don't know that, Richard. Is that right? Her father was chaplain to the British Embassy in Paris, and they skedaddled from Paris after the Commune, came back to Britain. She lived in the New Forest in Brockenhurst. She tried to get a society going in Brockenhurst. She married quite late in life, and lived for a time in the States. But yeah.
Interesting.
Lovely. So has anybody else got any more questions from Andrew? Because if not, we will finish a bit earlier today. I know we usually go on until 7:30, but if nobody's got any more questions, any more? Okay.
I could plug my book one more time.
So I'd like to say a big thank you to you, Andrew, for taking on guest speaker role for this week, this meeting. So thank you ever so much. And thanks to everybody for taking time out of your evening to join us. Our next meeting is on the 10th of August. We'll have another guest speaker, which is to be confirmed. So, excuse me. What I'll do is I'll send you all an email once I've confirmed that. And again, although I have sent you all the dates with the links, I'll also pop the link in the email again in case it's fallen out of people's calendars. But other than that, it's just have a lovely evening. Thank you so much. Yes, Andrew?
I'm just replying to the comment on Brick on Brick. It's a book
Oh,
about
okay.
the Co-operative Permanent Building Society, now nationwide, of course. And it was written by Mansbridge.
Yes, but I think
as mentioned by Richard.
I think the same title or a very similar title was used for a 50th anniversary book.
Okay.
The History of Southwest Co-operative Society. I've only ever seen
maybe a
one
different
copy.
book. Yeah.
John Butler, former Secretary of Co-ops UK, lent me his copy about 20 years ago, and I returned it, and I've never seen it again. So I suspect it was privately published by the Society, and there were probably only a couple of hundred editions published. But if you can get hold of a copy, it's very interesting because it explains some of the ways that the regulatory regime during the 60s and 70s in particular made it harder and harder and harder to have a genuinely cooperative element in a society that got.
Oh, that's obviously very different from Mansbridge book, which is much earlier history, actually. Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
I think what we've realised is, there is so much more to research out there. There's so many more interesting strands that just need a bit of time and attention. There's a lot more to be uncovered, I think. Sorry, Karen, you were just wrapping up.
I was just going to say, also, just for everybody, just to give you an update on Anne's book. So Anne and Ange have actually finished the book, and it's now with Edward, Pete Westall and Helen just to go through and everything. So again, I'll give you another update once we have further information on that as well. So if that's all from everybody, have a lovely evening and a lovely weekend. And thanks again for taking the time out this evening and joining us. So thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye then. Thanks, everyone. Yep.